Before we begin, this episode contains detailed descriptions of pandemic illness, mass death, and some medieval medical practices that may be distressing. If you're listening with young children or are sensitive to these topics, please take care. This is the story of the deadliest pandemic in human history, and I will not be sanitizing it. In the summer of 1349, a ship drifted into the harbor of Bergen on the western coast of Norway. It was a merchant vessel. It was English, probably carrying wool or wine or grain. Nothing unusual, nothing that would have drawn a crowd, except no one on board was moving. When the harbor officials finally boarded, they found every man dead. The crew lay where they had fallen, on the deck, in the hold, at the tiller. Their bodies were cold. Their skin was darkened in patches, as if bruised from the inside. The ship had become a tomb. No one knows the name of that ship. No one knows the names of the men who died on it, but we know what they carried. It had already killed millions in China, in Persia, in the ports of the Mediterranean, in England and France, and the Holy Roman Empire. And now it had reached the north. The Norwegians called it Svartedauden, the Great Death. The Swedes called it Digerdöden, the Great Death. By the time it was finished, it would kill more people than any war, any famine, any catastrophe in recorded history, and it would change Sweden forever. Welcome to Beyond the Swedish Postcard. Let's start with what the people of the 14th century could not know. The Black Death was caused by a bacterium. We call it Yersinia pestis, named after Alexandre Yersin, the Swiss-French physician who identified it in 1894 during an outbreak in Hong Kong. But in 1350, no one in Sweden had ever seen a bacterium. No one knew that the disease could be transmitted by something smaller than the eye could see. What they knew was this: people were dying fast, horribly, and nothing they did could stop it. The plague came in three forms. The first was bubonic, the most common. It got its name from the buboes, the swollen, pus-filled lymph nodes that appeared in the victim's armpits, groin, and neck. These swellings could grow the size of an egg, sometimes an apple. They were agonizing to touch. The skin around them turned dark, then black as the tissue died from the inside. The second form was pneumonic. This was the lung plague. The bacteria invaded the respiratory system. Victims coughed up blood. They gasped for air. They drowned in their own fluids. And with every cough, every breath, they sprayed the bacteria into the air around them. This form spread from human to human without rats, without fleas, just proximity, just breathing. The third form was septicemic. This was the blood plague. The bacteria multiplied directly in the bloodstream. The body went into septic shock, organs failed, the skin turned deep purple, almost black, from internal bleeding. This form killed so fast that sometimes the buboes never even had time to appear. If you were infected with the bubonic form, you had maybe a week. With the pneumonic form, 2 or 3 days. With the septicemic form, you might go to bed feeling fine and never wake up. And here's the thing about how it spread, the thing we're still arguing about. For centuries, we told a simple story. The black rat, Rattus rattus, carried fleas. The fleas carried the bacterium. The fleas bit humans, the humans died, case closed. Except it might not be that simple. Recent research, genetic analysis, epidemiological modeling, a hard look at the speed of the spread suggests that rats may not have been the primary vector at all. The plague moved too fast. It reached places where black rats couldn't survive the winter. Norway, for example, with its brutal cold and its isolated fjord communities, had almost no rats in the 14th century, and yet Norway lost a third of its population. So, what killed them? The leading alternative is horrifying in its intimacy: human fleas and body lice. The plague may have spread not from rats to humans, but from human to human through the parasites that lived in their clothing, in their bedding, their hair, every embrace, every shared blanket, every crowded room, a vector so small, so ubiquitous that no one could have escaped it. We don't know for certain. The debate is ongoing, but the image is worth sitting with. No rats in the grain stores, but fleas in the bed sheets. The enemy was already in the house. It had been there all along. The plague didn't start in Europe. It started somewhere in Central Asia, the steppe, the grasslands, the vast interior of the continent where Yersinia pestis had been circulating in rodent populations for millennia. It reached the Black Sea by 1346, carried by Mongol armies besieging the Genoese trading colony of Kaffa. The Mongols catapulted their own dead over the walls, an early brutal form of biological warfare. The Genoese fled by ship. They carried the plague to Messina, to Genoa, to Venice. From there, it exploded. By 1348, it was in England and France, in the cities of the Holy Roman Empire, in the Papal States, in the kingdoms of the Iberian Peninsula. And then it turned north. The plague traveled by water. It always does, port to port, ship to ship, rat to rat, human to human. The Hanseatic League, the great trading network that connected the Baltic and the North Sea ports, became a highway for disease. Grain from Prussia, wool from England, timber from Norway, and hidden in the cargo, in the fur of rats, in the bedding of sailors, in the lungs of merchants, the bacterium. Bergen fell in 1349. The ghost ship drifted into the harbor, and within months, a third of Norway's population was dead. The Archbishop of Nidaros in Trondheim wrote a letter. I'll read you the fragment. The living are not enough to bury the dead. From Norway, the plague crossed the mountains into Sweden. It likely entered through multiple points: the west coast, the southern provinces, and critically, the island of Gotland, Visby. Visby in 1350 was one of the wealthiest cities in the Baltic. It sat at the crossroads of the Hanseatic trade routes, ships to Novgorod and Lubeck. From Danzig, from London, goods and people and animals and parasites from across the known world packed together inside the great limestone walls. It was the perfect place for the plague to land. And here's the mystery. In London, archaeologists have found plague pits, mass graves dug in haste, bodies stacked on bodies under what is now the financial district. In Bergen, mass graves have been excavated. In France, in Italy, in Germany, the dead were buried in trenches, in churchyards, and fields outside the city walls. But Visby? Almost nothing. A city of thousands, a death rate that likely approached 50%, and yet almost no mass graves from the Black Death have ever been found on Gotland. Where are the dead? Were they buried in wooden coffins that rotted away centuries ago, leaving no trace? Were they burned in pits, the ash scattered by the wind? Were they interred in churchyards so thoroughly reused that the bones were ground to dust? Or is there a plague cemetery somewhere under the medieval streets of Visby, under the cobblestones, under the rose gardens, under the tourist shops waiting to be found? We don't know. The ground on Gotland keeps its secrets. What we do know is this: the plague arrived, it arrived by ship, and when it left, the island was changed forever. Let me try to describe what it felt like to live through this. Not the numbers, not the statistics, not the percentage of the population, but the experience. the texture of daily life when death was everywhere. You wake up, your husband is burning with fever. There's a swelling in his armpit, hard and hot to the touch. By nightfall, he's coughing blood. By the next morning, he's dead. You send your son to fetch the priest. The priest doesn't come. The priest is dead. You bury your husband in the field behind the house because the churchyard is full. You cover him with stones to keep the animals away. You don't have time to grieve. Your daughter is sick now. The same fever, the same swellings. Within a week, you are the only one left in the house. You are the only one left in the village. The Bishop of Linköping sent a letter to his diocese in 1350. He knew it was coming. He told his people to prepare their souls, to confess, to make peace with God. He couldn't offer them safety. He could only offer them a good death. But in many places, even that was denied. Priests died at a higher rate than the general population, not because they were more vulnerable, though they were by the nature of their work, but because they stayed. They administered last rites, they heard confessions, they touched the dying, and they died doing it. In some parishes, every single priest was dead within weeks. The sacrament stopped. The bells fell silent. The dying died alone, without absolution, without communion, without anyone to close their eyes. That was the terror of the Black Death, not just the dying, but the dying alone. After the plague passed, the silence remained. In Sweden, the Black Death created something archaeologists call udegårdar, deserted farms, not one or two, thousands. Before the plague, the Swedish crown kept meticulous tax records. Every farm, every household, every head of cattle, every barrel of grain owed to the king. After 1350, page after page reads Ude, deserted, vacant, empty, mortus, dead. The fields that had been plowed for generations grew over with grass. The grass gave way to scrub. The scrub gave way to forest. Within a generation, you could walk through the Swedish countryside and not know that a village had ever been there. The houses crumbled. The hearthstones sank into the earth. The bones of livestock lay unburied in the byres. In the 20th century, archaeologists started finding them, not by digging, by looking, by noticing that the forest floor was a little too even in places, that the stones were a little too square, that the plants were a little too lush, the telltale sign of old phosphorus in the soil from centuries of human waste and animal manure. They found entire villages that had been abandoned and forgotten over 500 years. One of the most famous is Kvarntorp in Östergötland, a whole village swallowed by the forest, stone foundations, a mill, a smithy. The archaeologists found a coin from the 1340s, then nothing. No coins from later decades, no pottery, no bones. The village simply stopped. Another is Buda in Småland. Same story, same silence. There were hundreds of these, maybe thousands. The exact number is still debated. But imagine it. Imagine walking through a Swedish forest, the pine, the moss, the quiet, and realizing that you're standing in someone's kitchen, that the mound of earth beside you was once a hearth, that the people who lived here died in such numbers that the survivors simply walked away and never came back. That's the landscape the Black Death left behind, a landscape of ghosts. And yet, not everyone died. Not every village was abandoned. Not every field returned to forest. And in the aftermath of the Great Death, something unexpected happened. Here's where Sweden's story diverges from much of the rest of the medieval world. In England, after the plague, the crown passed the Statute of Laborers, a law that froze wages at pre-plague levels and forced the landless to work for whoever demanded it. The result was anger, resistance, and eventually the Peasants' Revolt of 1381. In Russia and in Poland, the nobility tightened their grip. Serfdom. That's the binding of peasants to the land they worked, with no right to leave. That deepened and spread. It would last for centuries. But Sweden? Sweden didn't have serfs. What it had was a remarkably free peasantry. Some were tenant farmers, renting land from the nobility with fixed contracts that lasted 4 to 8 years. They could negotiate. They could leave. They had rights. Some were freeholders, skattebunder, who owned their own land outright and paid taxes directly to the crown. They had a seat in the Riksdag, the parliament of the four estates. No other European peasantry had anything like it, and some were landless laborers, forced by law to enter service if they had no other means. This was a hard life, the hardest. But these were not thralls. Slavery, the Viking Age system of thraldom, had faded out by the 13th century. The laborer could not be bought and sold. He could not be killed without consequence. He had, in theory, the protection of the law. After the Black Death, those landless laborers found themselves with something they had never had before: leverage. Half the workforce was gone, the fields were empty, the landlords were desperate, and suddenly a farmhand could demand better wages, better conditions, better treatment, because if one estate said no, the estate next door would say yes. The nobility hated it. They tried to pass laws. They tried to freeze wages. They tried to force the old order back into place. It didn't work. The Swedish peasant entered the late medieval period with rights and political representation that were exceptional by European standards. The plague didn't create that freedom. It was already there in seed form, in the old traditions of the Thing assemblies, in the relative weakness of the Swedish nobility, in the scattered, forested landscape that made centralization control difficult. But the plague watered it. And in the spiritual realm, something else was shifting. We'll talk about Saint Brigitte properly in the next episode. She deserves her own time. But we can't leave the Black Death without acknowledging what it did to the soul of Sweden. Before the plague, the church was the center of everything. It baptized you, it married you, it heard your confession, it gave you the last rites, it buried you in consecrated ground, it promised you that if you followed its rules, you would be saved. And then the plague came. And the church failed, not for a lack of trying. Priests died in staggering numbers trying to serve the dying. The Bishop of Linköping stayed at his post. The monasteries opened their doors as hospitals. The devout did what they could, but the prayers didn't work. The processions didn't work. The relics of the saints didn't work. The flagellants, these are groups of men and women who traveled from town to town, whipping themselves bloody in public, begging God for mercy. That didn't work. The Pope declared them heretical. It made no difference either way. By the time the plague receded, something had cracked in the medieval worldview. The old certainties that God protected the faithful, that the church held the keys to salvation, that the world was ordered and just, were no longer tenable. Not after you'd buried your children, not after you watched your priest flee, not after you've seen the graveyards fill and the fields go empty and the bells fall silent. Some people turn to mysticism, personal, emotional, visionary encounters with the divine. This is where Brigitte comes in, and we'll get to her. Some people turn to cynicism: eat, drink, and be merry, for tomorrow we die, literally. And some people turned away from religion entirely, not in a dramatic public way. Atheism as we know it didn't quite exist, but in a quiet, private way, a turning inward, a hardening of the heart. The Black Death didn't kill God, but it killed something: trust, maybe, certainty, the easy, unreflective faith of the early medieval world. I want you to sit with this for a moment. A third of Europe died. In Norway, in England, in France, in the German lands, in Sweden, somewhere between a quarter and a half of the population. We'll never know the exact number. The records don't exist. The dead are silent. But the Great Death wasn't just a tragedy, it was a reset. a pivot, a moment when the trajectory of an entire civilization bent. The old labor system crumbled. The church's moral authority eroded. The forest swallowed the abandoned farms. The language changed. In Norway, the educated class that could write Norwegian was so thoroughly wiped out that official government documents shifted to Danish, and Norwegian as a written language essentially vanished for centuries. And the survivors? They walked out of the plague years into a different world. A world with more land, more resources, more bargaining power. A world where the old rules no longer applied. Not that long ago, we went through our own pandemic. We know what it feels like to watch the world slow to a halt, to count the dead, to wonder if things will ever feel normal again. They did eventually, but they were never the same. And neither were they after 1350. If this episode made you think differently about what lies beneath the surface of history, please share it with someone who loves history. And if you haven't already, follow the show so you don't miss what comes next. Next time on Beyond the Swedish Postcard, we turn from the silent villages and empty fields to a voice that refused to be silenced. Saint Birgitta of Sweden, mystic, prophet, mother of 8, the woman who buried 2 of her children during the plague and then stood up and told popes and kings exactly what God thought of them. That's next time. Until then, keep looking beyond the Swedish postcard.